Alright, so I played a game recently called Syndicate. What a strange game, in multiple ways at that. Anyway, the easiest way for me to describe this would be Disco Elysium-like. A CRPG without combat entirely focused on the story with some stats, skill checks, inventory management and the like. It's a bit rough around the edges and confusing in the way it delivers the story by switching between characters, but I believe there's something here. Something to praise and recommend. What is it about? Well, it's kind of a complicated setup. A Victorian-era England, London especially, but with mythological creatures. Magic too. The main character is a minotaur, for example. There's also a dwarf with a sentient robot companion. 3 playable characters, in fact. The story is focused, it's unfocused. There are a lot of topics here, such as investigations of serial killings, kidnappings, dealing with organized crime, and more. It's hard to put it all together, because some of it is very minor, like feeding a cat, and some of it is huge, like the main story of the game, which has a lot going into it. Anyway, yeah, lots and lots of story. What did I enjoy? Well, weirdly enough, the delivery of the story. At first it's completely unapproachable. Player wakes up as a drunk minotaur and gets threatened by a masked man. Then they can go into the sewers, or not. That suddenly gets cut to when player is a prostitute who just woke up after sleeping with one of the richest men in London. She then walks around the place only to cut, and now play as a dwarf who goes around monster hunting. Does that sound coherent? Because it bloody sure didn't seem like that to me. But after a while the game settled into a certain rhythm. As if one character has something happen, and despite not being directly involved to that event, something new gets revealed for another character. Eventually everything very much falls into place, and by the end in the mansion I was looking forward to the eventual switch between them. The end in itself was also, well, I suppose it was a cliché, but, well, I enjoyed it. It felt earned, and it's not as if tropes become cliché because they are bad. Aside from that, story itself was well made, well enough. I do believe there is a bit too much text, but the whole setup, trickle of clues, and the eventual reveal of it all, it was well paced. Which leans into the way it was delivered, of course, but I'd like to point that out as a separate topic. Would also add that there's a flair to each character. There's a lot of repetition here, with people going around the same places, talking to the same people, but the things they say, think, and do are different. Meaning in some cases, Minotaur, for example, can get insulted and ignored, while Dolly would get treated well and have a conversation. Dwarf, meanwhile, is respected and seen as something of a living legend, so people try to talk his ear off. But to himself, he often thinks that he's got better stuff to do than trade niceties. It's a nice attention to detail, although not the one which actually pays off too often. But I'd rather not go into it right now. Also, Otto. The dwarf character Teddy has a robot companion who is named Otto. At one point the player can buy an upgrade for him, and then the two can go their separate ways. At least for a time. This means that the player can get a chapter wholly dedicated to playing as Otto, and he's even got a monochrome filter because he doesn't have an upgrade to see color. So the chapter involves walking around and essentially going through everything again, but it's pretty much comedic. Otto keeps naively asking people to give him a job, but it never works out and sometimes backfires entirely, with hijinks ensuing. In some circumstances he decides to go exploring, and that unlocks a music box, which then leads toward a scene. I won't spoil what happens, it's beautifully bizarre and I adored it. So, well then, what did I dislike? Well, the general rule for this sort of game is that there is a main story, but there is also a lot of side content, which sometimes bleeds into the main story. For example, more clues, or some sort of dialogue unlocked for a later scene. Beautiful Desolation is another game with this kind of routine. It's similar to a point-and-click 2, I suppose, but the problem with this approach is that there are a lot of places to be, a lot of objects to interact with, and a lot of people to talk to, and knowing when the player can see or change something is entirely random. I kept clicking on the same things, and in some circumstances there actually was in fact a different interaction, but it proved to not actually do much of anything. And sometimes I randomly wandered into something or somewhere only to discover a huge scene. Figuring out when and how to play is surprisingly difficult. So it boiled down to walking everywhere and clicking on everything, which is simply a frustrating way to design a game. Problem here is what I understand it from the developer's standpoint. Making it obvious and empty, leaving only a few interactable objects, take a lot out of world building, mystery and general story as a whole. I've played a different game with the same kind of map design. So the player can walk around a large area and there are a few things to click on. In that game the entire map would be huge, but only like 3 things would be clickable with only a sentence being said for each. And maybe 1 or 2 NPCs who give fetch quests. I won't mention the name of the game because I'm trying to avoid excess negativity, but needless to say I hated it. There you can see what happens if this kind of problem is solved and replaced with a completely empty, boring world instead. So what I'm saying is that Sovereign Syndicate approach is definitely something I prefer, but it's obviously a flawed one either way. There are far too many small interactable objects which give little to no payoff, with the ones which contribute to a bigger picture or offer clues are very few and far between. Aside from that, there were occasionally moments where the chapter ended and I was not expecting it to end yet. Some things left undone, dialogue left unsaid. Thankfully, generally there is a certain length for all these temporary things. For example, Clara can talk to a short Cyclops and buy a remedy to help him grow. I forgot to do that before the chapter ended, but I could turn it in later. This happens all the way in chapter 2 out of 18. However, once I encountered this, I was very cautious to not let any quest end, always double-checking everything. Again, it goes back to the way it is designed, but what I'm saying is that there could have been more warning before the last step, what could end the chapter. It definitely happened, there were a lot of warnings, don't get me wrong, but sometimes they just weren't there. Inconsistency is the word here. Also, I had a bit of a problem with a courtesan killer mystery. I believe there simply weren't enough clues to point out who it is early enough. I felt like the true culprit was not even a suspect, but only really close to the end of the game does it change, by which point it becomes instantly obvious who actually is the culprit. It could have been handled better. The other mysteries felt better laid out. This isn't a major problem, but it was a little annoying because I was trying to guess and didn't get a good payoff there. Anyway, I just want to add one thing. Disco Elysium is a game I did not like. It was disjointed, confusing, and pretty self-indulgent, as if a writer of it thought they were a total genius and can do no wrong. Meaning I feel like half of that game text could be cut out and it would improve. There were definitely brilliant moments, for example that woman with a drunk husband who went out on a bender. That story was extremely well done. Some of the best storytelling I've seen in a video game. But there was just so much more that I simply couldn't enjoy at all. Sovereign Syndicate felt the same way at first. However, I believe it's just better. There are lower production values and the overall level seems to be like a B-team developed game. Maybe better is not really a fitting word. I suppose it's more enjoyable, because I believe that there are a lot of games which are very complex, yet tedious and boring. And there are simpler ones which attempt the same thing yet somehow succeed at what should be inferior. It's, again, a problem of scope, capability and execution, and Sovereign Syndicate succeeds in that regard just enough to be worthy of praise.